You're watching our live and continuing coverage from the India Today war room.
Many demands from people of India, from politicians saying the government must act violently और उसको सर्जिकल स्ट्राइक्स का उसने नाम दे दिया, दूसरा प्रोपेगेंडा शुरू कर दिया।
बहुत बड़ी हो रही है, लेकिन हम जवाब कब देंगे?
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The airwaves over India and Pakistan are loud and getting louder, and the talk is about Kashmir and cross-border tensions. Burundi, radio silence on the airwaves in a country struggling through a constitutional crisis that could turn into another civil war. Propaganda can be lucrative. The public relations firm that banked $500 million from the Pentagon for spinning the story in Iraq. And if you're tired of election news from the US, just cover up. We begin with a story of two countries, both of them nuclear powers, with two distinct media spheres and two different journalistic representations of the same issue. India and Pakistan are at loggerheads, and again, the issue is Kashmir. This past month, an attack on an army base on the Indian side of the line of control left 19 Indian soldiers dead. The government in New Delhi quickly accused Pakistan of being responsible, and a spark was lit for the media on both sides of the border. On the Pakistani airwaves, newscasts have led with denials of responsibility from the military. On the Indian side, the mainstream narrative revolved largely around what would be an appropriate form of retaliation. Kashmir, territory that both sides claim, has seen clashes, protests, and curfews on the Indian-occupied side for 3 months now. The rhetoric on the Indian and Pakistani airwaves, where news channels often provide more heat than light, had already been ratcheted up. The cross-border attacks have taken the talk of war to another level. This is a precarious situation, and the media are not making the job of diplomats and governments any easier. Our starting point this week, once again, is Kashmir.
Five crack teams conducted operation.
Propaganda is a part of diplomacy.
Continuing coverage from the India Today war room.
Both Indian and Pakistanis have been indulging in massive propaganda wars.
बहुत ज़्यादा जल्दबाजी दिखाई जाती है और पाकिस्तान पर इल्जामात की बौछार कर दी जाती है.
I mean, it's the ultimate he says, she says, right?
The Indian Army conducted surgical strikes last night.
सर्जिकल स्ट्राइक्स का झूठा प्रोपेगेंडा भारत ने शुरू किया.
When you have a headline that says rage, I mean, what does that mean?
देश पर बहुत बड़ा हमला.
Conflict is great television.
मैं आपको वार्न कर रहा हूं कि इंडिया जो है वो पाकिस्तान से किसी न किसी बहाने जंग करना चाहता है.
So if they play up the conflict, they'll get more ratings.
And if they dress up for the conflict, those ratings might be higher still. Gaurav Savant anchors a primetime program on a news channel called India Today. He recently transformed his studio into what he calls a war room.
What should India's response be?
Savant is not the only loud, belligerent voice on the Indian airwaves these days, talking about Kashmir and Pakistan. He has plenty of company. He is just the only one making a statement sartorially.
You had Gaurav Savant, who came in khaki cargos and vest, fit enough to go to do war reportage, you know, had set up a military control room for his television program. And, you know, when somebody spoke about talking to Pakistan, etc., he said, no, we're only discussing military options here because this is a war room.
Send in the Air Force, send in the Army, or be covert, take out the leadership and have deniability.
This argument that the media has been trying to force the government's hand into a war-like situation with Pakistan, it's an old question. Whether Narendra Modi's hands were being forced by the media, I think the media was only reflecting the growing sense of resentment, the growing sense of anger which existed within India. And if that means that the media was forcing the government's hands towards a war, so be it.
Whether it's the Indian media or the Pakistani media, they have very little interest in seeing the truth of what the other side is saying. If the Indian media becomes very, very hostile.
Because till last week when Indian soldiers were dying, you said talk to Pakistan.
When there's flashing headlines, the Pakistani media feels that it is required to counter that propaganda.
भारत को पाकिस्तान पर मैली निगाह डालने की इजाजत नहीं दी जाएगी.
What's worse is that Pakistani channels, most of them do not air in India, and Indian channels do air in Pakistan, but definitely not the newsy channels. That ends up basically creating two very different vacuums. Pakistanis and Indians are consuming different news about the same events. So it's unfortunately driving a serious wedge between the two countries.
The Kashmir story has been boiling over for 3 months now. The unrest began with the killing by Indian forces of a young Kashmiri militant, Burhan Wani. Demonstrations erupted across Indian-administered Kashmir. Curfews were imposed, mobile phone services suspended, and a reported 70 civilians were killed in clashes with security forces, another 7,000 reported injured. Then came the cross-border attack on an Indian base that killed 19 soldiers. Delhi said Islamabad was behind the attacks. Pakistan has been known to fund and train militants who target Indian soldiers based in Kashmir. India followed up with a series of retaliatory attacks against Pakistani targets in the region, strikes described by the government in Delhi as surgical.
Significant casualties have been caused to the terrorists.
I think that Indian forces certainly did strike Pakistan where it hurts them the most, but where Pakistan has been hurt even more is by India's decision to go public with it.
The army has raided at least 5 terror launch pads.
By going public, the Indian government changed the rules of engagement.
A couple of days later, the Pakistanis had really upped the ante and brought in around 40 journalists from local and international networks. The New York Times, the Associated Press, the BBC, AFP, everybody was in there. And it was interesting to see how those reports, which were essentially ascertaining that none of the locals have heard anything.
But we've been brought here by the Pakistani military to be shown that Indian claims of a surgical strike are nowhere to be found.
Maybe the Indian claims are a bit of an exaggeration.
It was a very, very clever move. And it actually threw the ball back in the Indian court. It said, well, we've shown in the international media what's happening on the ground.
This is one of the points that Indian military is saying, that they crossed over and conducted a surgical strike.
We've shown proof of the fact that this so-called surgical strike did not take place. Well, show us yours.
That the Kashmir story is so ever-present on the airwaves of South Asia is, historically speaking, appropriate, because Kashmir helped shape the broadcasting landscape there. In 1999, Pakistan still had just one television channel, the state-owned PTV. When fighting erupted in Kashmir over the strategic city of Kargil, multiple privately owned Indian news channels rode that story hard. India eventually prevailed on the ground, and the government in Islamabad would soon make changes affecting what would go out on the air.
And this is when the Indian private television media was emerging. This was their, let's say, baptism of fire. These journalists went to Kargil, they showed bodies of Indian soldiers. India blocked Dawn, which is Pakistan's premier newspaper. So the Indian side couldn't see what the Pakistanis were saying. And what you had was a lot of nationalism, patriotism, the war.
In a way, the Kargil conflict was inspiring for Pakistan because Pakistan saw what a nationalist or a hyper-nationalist media did for India. It brought India together.
Counterattacks have started from the Pakistani side.
Versus Pakistan's own state-run media, which is very bleak and anemic. Interestingly, General Musharraf, who was ruling after that conflict through a coup, brought in Pakistani media to emulate the hyper-nationalist Indian media. So the tone was set in the 90s, and the rest of it is history.
Or history on the run, as journalism has been called. Not that everything on the South Asian airwaves these days can be called journalism. Some of it is jingoism, camouflaged as war reporting, talking tough from the safety of the studio. Other media stories that are on our radar. Americans learned this past week that the Pentagon spent $500 million of their tax dollars on a public relations firm which ran a top-secret propaganda program in Iraq, including the production of fake al-Qaeda videos. The story was broken by the London-based Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and the PR firm in question is Bell Pottinger, also based in London. The Bureau reported that Bell Pottinger was brought into Iraq in 2004 and tasked with what it described as the promotion of democratic elections. The Bureau says it spoke to a video editor, Martin Wells, who produced Arabic-language TV reports that were distributed to news stations in the Middle East. He says he was also told to make fake al-Qaeda videos, which were planted around the country in U.S. military raids and then digitally tracked to identify suspected al-Qaeda sympathizers. Tim Bell, the PR firm's founder, is a former advisor to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Asked by the Sunday Times about the work his company did in Iraq, Bell said, "We were very proud of it. We did a lot to help resolve the situation. Not enough. We did not stop the mess which emerged, but it was part of the American propaganda machinery." Another political voice has fallen silent in Ethiopia with the arrest of a well-known blogger and university lecturer. Seyum Teshome is a frequent contributor to the website ethiothinktank.com, but has not been seen since October 1st. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, says it spoke to one Ethiopian reporter exiled in Kenya who said police arrested Teshome at his home and confiscated his computer. The academic wrote about the recent protests involving Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, the Oromo people, who say that their voices have been marginalized by the government in Addis Ababa. His last share on Facebook linked to an article in the New York Times in which he discusses the frustrations of Ethiopian youth, saying, if you suffocate people and they don't have any other options but to protest, it breaks out. The whole youth is protesting. A generation is protesting. According to the CPJ, this arrest of a prominent writer is deeply disturbing, as it comes against a backdrop of government moves to stifle protests and criticism. Seyum Teshome should be released without delay and without condition. It looks like Beijing may have shut down yet another digital platform, one whose comment and analysis from across the political spectrum can be seen as a form of political dissent. Consensus.net launched in 2009 with the motto to reach a consensus in an era of great transformation. The site grew popular with Chinese intellectuals of all political stripes. However, users trying to get to the homepage on the 1st of October, China's National Day, were redirected to a notice saying that it's down for program upgrades. The site's founder and CEO, Zhou Zhixing, told the South China Morning Post, based in Hong Kong, that there was no order to stop the operation of the site, but added that it is unclear when it will reappear. Consensus is not the only site to attract the recent attention of censors in Beijing. 3 months ago, the liberal online magazine Yanhuang Chunqi was forcibly taken over by the state-run National Academy of Art. It stopped publishing shortly thereafter. For a year and a half now, the Central African country of Burundi has been on the brink of civil war. In 2015, President Pierre Nkurunziza, already in power for more than 10 years, announced that he would be seeking a third term, which the Constitution forbids and which also violates the 2005 Arusha Peace Agreement, which ended a 12-year-long civil war that left 300,000 people dead. Burundians took to the streets to protest their president's proposed third term. That was followed by an attempted military coup which failed. And the result for the Burundian media was a government crackdown on dissent. Accused of allying with the opposition, all independent radio stations were closed in a country where illiteracy and a lack of internet access make the population reliant on radio as the primary source of news and information. The stories now going unreported include cases of mass murder, forced disappearances, torture, as well as a refugee crisis affecting more than 400,000 people. Then there's the specter of what happened next door in Rwanda, the genocide of 1994. Like Rwanda, Burundi's ethnic makeup is majority Hutu, minority Tutsi. And given the role that the media, particularly radio, played in Rwanda, many Burundians fear that their state media outlets may, through their broadcasts, turn this political crisis into an ethnic one. The Listening Post's Johanna Hoos now on the challenges of reporting in Burundi.
On the 13th of May 2015, Burundians heard this message on the radio.
J'ai l'honneur de vous annoncer que suite à l'insécurité qui règne dans notre pays, que les frontières burundaises sont fermées.
Following weeks of mass protests opposing President Pierre Nkurunziza's controversial bid for a third term, a faction of the army took over the airwaves of the country's most popular privately owned radio station, Radio Publique Africaine, in an attempt to claim control over the country.
Nous crions à tout homme chargé de la défense nationale, tout militaire, de faire tout son possible, de faire respecter ses consignes.
The coup was a failure. The Nkurunziza government pushed back against the rebel soldiers and shut down all private radio stations. A year and a half later, the president remains in power and the media blackout continues. Burundian journalists blame the government for the media crackdown, but the government tells a different story.
Certains médias ont connu.
Admittedly, some media outlets have faced problems. Why? Because the same groups or individuals who attempted to overthrow Burundi's democratically elected institutions destroyed those outlets. We have the evidence.
Qui l'ont fait.
The government's evidence was never shown to us. What we did find was footage from just hours after the coup attempt, when forces loyal to the president stormed the offices of Radio Publique Africaine, which was later set ablaze. 3 other radio stations faced similar attacks. All 4 remain closed, and their journalists say they continue to be targeted by the government.
La situation que le Burundi traverse.
Since April 2015, the situation here has been very difficult for the media. They are seen as the opponent. The people from the government who are convinced that the media played a decisive role in the organization of the failed coup, which is particularly difficult for the journalists who have stayed working in the field.
Il y a des gens qui sont poursuivis.
Yes, the authorities are pursuing certain journalists, but only those who supported the coup. The opinion of international media will continue to be swayed by those saying the Burundian government is hunting down all journalists. We regret that people got killed, but we hope that the world sees that this is a conspiracy orchestrated by the opposition.
Machination orchestrée par l'opposition.
With nearly all private radio outlets shut down and numerous journalists forcibly exiled or disappeared, Burundians are facing an information vacuum. It is only pro-government or state outlets that remain to fill the void. A growing concern is that these outlets are spinning narratives of ethnic division, ringing alarm bells for Burundians who remember the genocide across the border in Rwanda, which has an ethnic makeup almost identical to Burundi's.
Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment.
In 1994, repeated messages of hate, broadcast on a Rwandan radio station controlled by Hutus, Radio Libre Mille Collines, exacerbated ethnic tensions there. Rwandans took up arms, and in the bloodshed that followed, more than 800,000 people, mostly Tutsi, were killed.
There are some interesting parallels in the sense that the 1994 genocide occurred in the context of a civil war, and it made people more susceptible to extreme messaging. Now, we're not quite at a civil war in Burundi, but in times of crisis, state media carry quite inflammatory messages. The term that we've used is ethnicization from above. This is a political manipulation of ethnic fears, which is orchestrated by the government to try to solidify their support among the Hutu population. And to do so, they need to say that we are being besieged by someone. And of course, who do they pick? Well, it's Tutsis, because Tutsis are the age-old enemy.
Burundi National Radio on TV, you know, it's a government-owned medium. So it means politicians come and issue declarations. They say things which are controversial. These lead some people to believe that the public media is playing a role in fueling the ethnic crisis.
Il n'y a pas de rhétorique génocidaire au Burundi.
This government doesn't use genocidal vocabulary. Under no circumstance has the government blamed the Tutsis. We have to establish the truth, particularly given that there are certain people who say Burundi is at risk of committing crimes against humanity and genocide. These allegations are part of a slanderous and defamatory campaign aimed at winning over the sympathy of the international community. It is a last resort by the rebels.
C'est finalement cela qui pouvait prendre.
In a media landscape as sparse as Burundi's, one privately owned, openly critical publication, Iwachu, stands out. The paper carries stories that none of Burundi's other papers will. Abductions by the ruling political party, the lack of investigation into the killing of opposition politicians, and the hounding of journalists. Iwachu's director is in exile, and a staff journalist has been missing for the past 2 months.
Iwachu has to go deep in some of the stories that the state media does not really cover. So if the state media are broadcasting things that seem to be making everybody believe that everything is fine in Burundi, you understand that there is something which lack. And what is it? There is this kind of economic downturn. There is the impact of this crisis on the daily lives of Burundians. This needs to be reported.
Iwachu is actually a long-standing news organisation in Burundi, and it's one of the best. It's reporting government actions, it's reporting human rights abuses, but it's doing so in quite a neutral way, and it's trying to not alienate the authorities too much while retaining its independence. So they're doing a tough job because they are one of the very few professional independent media outfits with proper editorial control still working inside Bujumbura. But we also have to remember the print media is pretty much absent outside Bujumbura.
That lack of reach is a challenge for Iwachu, but may also be the secret to its survival. Its circulation is so low that unlike radio broadcasts that can reach large audiences across the country, the government does not fear the paper's influence. Another outlet, SOS Media Burundi, is an underground broadcast collective that came together in the aftermath of the failed coup. It publishes radio reports online, and most of its journalists remain anonymous. However, in a country where internet access is so limited, SOS's impact online is negligible. Its real audience is outside the country.
We wanted to come up with a way to make sure the public, both inside and outside the country, weren't just being fed rumors. Everyone was spreading them, and people were consuming them as if they were word of God. I've never witnessed this level of rumor mongering, so we decided to create this online collective.
Here in Burundi, how many people can have access to the internet connection? Very few. It means that you can only follow SOS Media Productions when you use a social media like WhatsApp, when you use Facebook, Twitter, or any other social media. So SOS Media can hardly reach the majority of the people.
We know what we do is not enough. We're constantly pushing for the media that have been shut down to reopen. The absence of independent media is a serious blow for the Burundian public, who need information every day.
There is no sign that the space for independent journalism will reopen anytime soon. Burundi is going through a political crisis that could turn ethnic. And there is radio silence, except for those voices that the government wants people to hear.
And finally, what is la 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 la? Well, if you go to a website called la-la-la-la.us, it's either A, the childish sound that we make when we plug our ears to avoid something that we don't want to hear about, like this endless American presidential election campaign, or B, it's the best election blocking product on the market. It's a helmet that at the push of a button can surround your head with soundproof Kevlar, preventing sound bites from candidates, pundits, pollsters, and spin doctors from penetrating your cranium. It's the brainchild of a group called Represent.us, which calls itself the largest grassroots anti-corruption campaign in America. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Everywhere you look, something sucks. And that thing is this garbage circus of an election. Imagine a world where you never have to pay attention to politics again. A world where you have the power to ignore everything. Introducing La 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 La.
It's about design. It's about freedom. La 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 is the most elegant, self-numbing experience on the market. The challenge in developing La 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 technology was to provide adequate sensory deprivation without sacrificing sleek design and great hand feel.
La 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 engulfs the head and face parts of the head in soundproof Kevlar, preventing all visual and oral political aggravations.
It's that rich, dead to the world experience that has consumers choosing la 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 over our main competitors, alcohol, hard drugs, and reality.